It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Module 4.4, Climate and Environmental Projects in Public Procurement. Today we will discuss a corruption scheme, unjustified contract changes and scope creep in desk analysis. At the beginning, I'd like to put your attention to the reporting template. This webinar is designed to guide you through the monitoring process in a clear and structured way. It follows the same logic as the report for monitoring projects. The reporting template is divided into 3 steps. Step 1 is desk analysis. This is where you review the contract information. Step 2 focuses on contract implementation. And step 3 looks at the results and impact, evaluating whether the outcomes match the objectives and serve the public interest. In this webinar, we will be focusing on contract modifications and the corruption schemes that can arise from unjustified changes, often referred to as scope creep. We will look at why these modifications matter and what red flags supervisors should watch for. By understanding these risks, you will be better prepared to spot irregularities early, strengthen oversight, and ensure that projects deliver what was originally promised. Let's dive straight into action. At the beginning, let me ask you a question. What can actually be changed in a contract? Well, there are a few key areas. Firstly, the deadline for completion, or sometimes the deadline for completing a specific stage of a contract. Secondly, the contractor itself. And thirdly, the scope of the order and the way the work is carried out. And finally, also can be changed the remuneration along with the method of payment. Time to explore the topic of contract changes. In simple terms, they mean changing the original agreement, adjusting the scope, the budget, the timeline, or other key elements. In practice, modifications usually happen because of unexpected situations, evolving project needs, or to fix mistakes in the original contract. Let me give you a few examples. A riverbank restoration project might need extra time if flooding delays construction. Or a wind farm installation could require additional safety measures, leading to extra work. Or a waste management audit might uncover new requirements that weren't foreseen at the start. These changes can extend the contract's duration or adjust its value, but only within legally defined limits. In other terms, every modification has to follow strict rules. It must comply with the original contract and stay within the limits of national and EU procurement laws. And of course, yes, a public notice has to be published so everyone knows what has changed. Let's imagine a project where educational trail was planned inside a national park. The environmental authorities agreed to the specific scope, that is to design and build an ecologically friendly educational trail. I think we can all agree that once the contract is underway, you cannot simply introduce such a major change to the project scope, like we can see on this photograph. Imagine we are restoring a river habitat. Halfway through implementation, Heavy rains wash away part of the site, and suddenly the project needs more time, more money, and extra work. That is exactly where contract modifications come in. They allow us to adapt so the project can still succeed. Now we will turn our attention to changes in the contracts that relate to environmental conditions and to projects that require environmental consent or decision. Some infrastructure projects require formal environmental consent, and in certain cases, they additionally require environmental impact assessment procedure. Within the development consent or environmental decision, specific environmental requirements are listed, and those requirements must be incorporated into the project and its design. The environmental conditions deriving from administrative decisions cannot be changed. If the environmental decision or building permit says that we must protect local bird species in a certain way, manage water in a certain way, or monitor air quality in a certain way, those obligations stay. No contract modification can erase them. These requirements can cover many aspects: the project's design, the way construction works are carried out, the conditions for climate adaptation measures, environmental supervision during the works, compensation measures like replanting trees or restoring habitats, or even ecological monitoring after the project's completion. In practice, those environmental requirements in administrative decisions serve as an excellent checklist for a monitor to verify whether everything is being done in line with the requirements, so the project doesn't harm the environment and achieves the expected environmental performance. So let me just repeat again. Contract modifications must never weaken or bypass the environmental requirements set out in development consent or environmental decisions, especially when the project has gone through an environmental impact assessment procedure. We really need to keep these conditions in place because they are what guarantee the project stays environmentally sound and that the development is carried out responsibly. In the monitoring template, you may find useful questions to spot the difference between necessary adjustments and red flags. Public contract modifications can be perfectly legitimate, like extending the deadline because of floods or other unexpected events. But they can also be abused. Without transparency and oversight, modifications might become a tool for inflating costs or hiding poor performance, which risks in misusing public funds. That is why monitoring modifications is so important. They directly affect how money is spent and whether climate and environmental projects meet their objectives. So the key question we should always ask is, were these changes truly unforeseeable, or are they just a way to bend the rules? Or is it about extra works or services that became necessary but weren't included in the original procurement? Because modifications change the rule of the game. They can also be vulnerable to corruption if not handled transparently. Proper oversight is necessary. Let's start with a story. In one city, Waste management contracts were supposed to be temporary, but instead of opening new tenders, officials kept extending them. The scope of work grew bigger and bigger, often justified as an emergency. The same politically connected firms kept cashing in. And this is a textbook case of unjustified contract modifications and the scope creep. What should citizens, what should monitors look for? If contracts keep getting extended without competition, that's a warning sign. Sudden scope changes labeled as urgent often mask corruption. If the same firms win again and again, or costs rise faster than services delivered, those are red flags during the implementation phase. Worth to notice.
Alright, get ready for a solid dose of knowledge. In this session, we'll dive into how to spot corruption red flags by analyzing documents during contract implementation, including those tied to climate and environmental projects. Now, let's be honest, you won't see flashy graphics or fireworks here. But what you will get is a huge amount of practical, substantive insight. It's definitely worth listening closely and sticking with us until the end, because it's going to be interesting and extremely useful. So the question is how contract modifications can be monitored and what are some extra tools predicted in national law in order to enhance transparency regarding contract modifications. Let's start with the Polish law. Under Polish public procurement law, the contracting authority has to prepare a report on how the contract was carried out. In that report, they evaluate the performance of the contractor, and this report must be prepared if one of these things happen. First, if the cost of carrying out the contracts ends up being at least 10% higher than the original tender price. Second, if the contractor has been hit with penalties that add up to at least 10% of the tender price. The question is how this information can be used to identify red flags. If the report on the performance of the contract shows that the value of the contract as a result of changes has increased by at least 10% compared to the tender price, this may lead to the conclusion, especially in the area of services and supplies, that we are dealing with the risk of additional elements of the contract that were already provided for in the contract or are unjustified. The lack of information regarding contractual penalties should prompt an analysis of whether the contractual penalties were justified and, if so, why the contracting authority refrained from imposing them. And the third case, when the contracting authority is obliged to draw up a contract performance report, is if there are delays in completing the contract. For big contracts, that means construction projects worth at least 20 million euros, or supply and services contracts worth at least 10 million euros, the delay has to be 90 days or more. For smaller contracts, below those amounts, the delay only has to be 30 days or more. And last but not least, if either the contracting authority or the contractor pulls out of the contract, whether completely or just partly, or if the contract is terminated in the whole or in part, then a report must also be done. The question is how this information can be used to identify red flags. Delays in the performance of the contract by the number of days and values indicated in this provision should prompt an analysis of whether the contract contained appropriately constructed so-called review clauses that made it possible to change the execution date in connection with the foreseeable circumstances of such a change. Delays should also prompt an analysis of whether the contracting authority is relying on unforeseen circumstances, and if so, what specific ones. Withdrawal from part of the contract should prompt an analysis of whether any settlement was reached between the parties to the contract during the execution of the contract. And now let's skip into an Italian law. This can be also a useful tool for searching documents under Italian law. According to Legislative Decree number 209 of December 2024, which updates and corrects Legislative Decree number 36 of 2023, the new Public Procurement Code, Annex number 2.14 requires that any contract modification must be published. This obligation comes from Article 28 on transparency of public contracts in Decree number 36 as modified by Decree number 209. All this information must be entered into the National Database of Public Contracts. In Italian, the Banca Dati Nazionale dei Contratti Pubblici, using the digital platforms mentioned in Article 25 of Decree number 36, the Public Procurement Code. The question is how this information can be used to identify red flags. All the data we can find according to the correct IT instrument of Italian institution responsible for anti-corruption policy, in Italian l'Autorità Nazionale Anticorruzione, can help to identify possible irregularities in the area of contract modification. For instance, in case of unforeseen circumstances. And let's not forget the fact that also EU law directives gives you a tool to monitor contract modification. Under EU law, contracts can be modified during their term in certain situations. One example is when extra work, services, or supplies are needed from the original contractor, but those weren't part of the initial agreement. Another case is when unexpected circumstances arise, things that a careful contracting authority could not reasonably have predicted, and those circumstances make a modification necessary. The question is how this information can be used to identify red flags. The above data will help in analyzing two potential red flag areas: changes due to unforeseen circumstances and additional works, supplies, or services. So as we can see in the directive number 24, if a contracting authority changes a contract in the situation of additional works, services, suppliers, or unforeseen circumstances, it must publish a notice in the official journal of the European Union. Also for contracting authorities under the directive number 25, if a contracting authority changes a contract in the situation of additional works, services, or suppliers, additional works or unforeseen circumstances, it must also publish a notice in the official journal of the European Union. As aforementioned, this information can be used to identify red flags, changes due to unforeseen circumstances, and additional works, suppliers, or services. So what kind of red flags can also appear in case of unjustified contract modifications? What are the red flags to watch out for in desk analysis? If a contract doesn't contain proper review clauses, so when and how the contract can be modified, or if it only makes a vague reference to the possibility of amendments, like saying, for instance, changes can be made for extra work or unforeseen circumstances, that's a warning sign. Amendments need to be spelled out in clear, precise, and unambiguous terms. In other words, the contract should set out detailed rules for how modifications can happen, not just rely on general wording. It is also important to see relevant Court of Justice of the European Union cases. Precetext, Suki di Frutta, and Obsztyna Razgrad. Another red flag is when amendment notices show that the value of the changes often goes beyond 15% of the net contract amount. That's a significant threshold and should raise concerns. And another red flag, when looking at contract amendment notices, you often see that the value of changes in services goes above 10% of the original contract amount. And also another possible red flag, compared to earlier contracts from the same contracting authority, there's now a noticeable rise in amendment notices that cite unforeseen circumstances as the reason. Similarly, compared to past contracts, there's an increase in amendment notices that justify changes by saying additional works or services were needed. Now, please let me draw your attention to unexpected events that might make it necessary to change a contract. This can include things like unforeseen delays, changes in project conditions, or new legal and environmental requirements. On this slide, you can also see the result of a hurricane, an example of how sudden natural disasters can force adjustments. In cases like this, making changes isn't just a matter of convenience. It's often the only way to keep the project on track and make sure it delivers what was promised. As you can see, on basis of Polish example, in Poland between January 1st, 2018 and February 28th of 2021, there were over 3,000 contract amendment notices posted for contracts made in Poland. But from March 1st of 2021 to May 31 of 2024, that number jumped to over 17,000. This big rise in amendments makes you wonder how the idea of unforeseeable circumstances is really being interpreted. And here another life-based example. This is an example of possible red flag, this time from Bulgaria. During the time allowed for the project, the works were suspended 6 times. 5 of those suspensions happened because of bad weather, and 1 was because the investment project needed to be revised. Now, the question is, can ordinary weather conditions, things that don't count as unforeseeable circumstances, and a legal ban on construction during a certain period, which was already announced before the contract was awarded, be considered a valid reason for not finishing the contract on time? The answer is no. Ordinary weather conditions aren't seen as something a careful contracting authority couldn't predict.
Thank you so much for staying engaged. We hope these red flags tips will help sharpen oversight in climate and environmental procurement projects. Thank you.